Now to the prize in this down-to-the-last-vote contest, victory in the Electoral College. The 2000 presidential election has raised new questions and demands for changes in this old institution. We start with some background from Kwame Holman.
There's a very real possibility Al Gore could win the popular vote nationwide, but fall short in electoral votes and lose the election. Curtis Gans with the Committee for the Study of the American Electorate says that's happened before.
That was true in 1824 when Andrew Jackson won more of the popular vote. It was true in the case of Samuel Tilden, who received more of the popular vote, I think, in 1876, and it was true in 1888.
And it could be true in the year 2000. That's because voters this year, as in every presidential election, actually chose electors, not a candidate. Voters in Florida could read a printed reminder of that fact right on the ballot. A vote for the candidates will actually be a vote for their electors.
These are the people who actually elect the president.
On Election Day in Florida, for example, a group of pro-Bush electors competed against Gore electors. The eventual winner of Florida's popular vote will have his electors chosen as well. 25 electors, each representing one of the state's 25 electoral votes. Across the country, there is a total of 538 electors or electoral votes. 2 electors from each state correspond to that state's U.S. Senate representation, for a total of 100. Then there's 1 elector for every member a state sends to the House of Representatives, 435 in all. Washington, D.C., which is not a state, chooses 3 electors. To get to the White House, a candidate must win the popular vote in enough states to collect 270 electoral votes. With official vote counts still outstanding in Oregon, New Mexico, and Florida, Al Gore has totaled 255 electoral votes, winning 19 states. George W. Bush has 246 electoral votes, capturing 29 states. If all goes as planned, the winning candidates' electors will gather in 50 state capitals on December 18th.
They cast their votes in December. The votes are kept and unsealed in January, and then the president is officially elected.
But the electoral system includes a few variations. First, no federal law requires an elector to vote for the party's candidate, and over the decades, a handful of electors has strayed. In 1976, for example, an elector pledged to Gerald Ford voted for Ronald Reagan, who'd lost to Ford in the Republican primaries. In 1988, a Democratic elector flipped the ticket, choosing Michael Dukakis for vice president and running mate Lloyd Bentsen for president. A second variation, exceptions to the state winner-take-all rule. In Maine and Nebraska, the winner in each congressional district wins that electoral vote. To some, the system seems antiquated, and indeed a serious effort to abolish the Electoral College was mounted in 1969, but the system survived.
We see in this election both the downsides and the upsides of the Electoral College. The downsides is obviously that we might end up with a result in which the popular vote winner doesn't win the electoral votes. And the other downside is that most of the firepower in this campaign have been concentrated in 17 states. The ones that are contested and a whole series of others that are not contested don't get any attention at all. On the other hand, on the upside, you have a situation in which in those states that are contested, you are getting a lot of activity. You are going to the grassroots. You are taking into account regional and local concerns. You are mobilizing various interests. And none of that would happen if you moved to direct elections, because essentially what you would have is sort of a national media campaign in which the pluralism of American democracy would be ignored.
Several members of Congress now say they're prepared to mount another challenge to the Electoral College.
Be abolished, Vice President Gore.
But it's not something Al Gore wants to focus on right now.
Margaret Warner takes it from there. She taped this discussion last night.
A post-election Gallup poll for CNN and USA Today found that 61% of Americans think it's time to abolish the Electoral College and elect presidents directly based on the popular vote. To debate the merits of that proposal, we're joined by 4 academics who've written widely on this subject. Charles Lipson, a political science professor at the University of Chicago. Lonnie Guinier, a professor at Harvard Law School. Gary Glenn, professor of political science at Northern Illinois University. And Judith Best, also a political science professor at the State University of New York at Cortland. Professor Lipson, beginning with you, you're an advocate of abolishing the Electoral College. Why?
Well, the basic reasons for having an electoral college were set out over 200 years ago, and none of those reasons apply anymore. The basic reasons were that the founders, the men, and they were men who wrote the Constitution, wanted to put a kind of buffer between the people and the selection of a president. They wanted, on the one hand, a democracy, but on the other hand, some buffer from the tumult of the crowd. Also, some of the individual states were concerned that if you voted one person, one vote, the southern states, which had a lot of slaves, would have less weight. None of those reasons apply anymore. We don't need a buffer between the individuals in the vote. Most of us think we're voting for a president. Our basic principle of a democracy is one person gets one vote. And in general, I think that there are a number of specific problems that can crop up with the system. Unfaithful electors, the number of electors that each state gets is based on the last census, which in this case was a 1990 census. So some states that have lost population are overweighted. Others
let me just interrupt you right there, because you've already laid out a couple of reasons, and go to Professor Glenn. Take head on that argument that, one, it's really outlived its original purpose, and two, that it violates the sort of American principle of one man, one vote.
Well, my first response is that it has not outlived its original purposes, especially the purpose of protecting sparsely populated states from being steamrollered by mere numerical national majorities. That is a constitutional principle of our system of government, not one man, one vote by itself. We count the popular vote in the Electoral College, and we count it by state. Just the same way we count the popular vote for the House of Representatives and for the Senate. We don't have any constitutional offices at the national level that are elected by a mere popular majority, irrespective of geography.
And let me interrupt you for a sec just to explain. So you are saying that it protects the smaller states because in effect they get more weight. That is, because they get these 2 automatic ones for their senators, plus then 1 apportioned by population.
Yes, they get more weight in the same way that they get more weight in the House of Representatives, where every state, regardless of population, is guaranteed 1 vote and 1 congressman, and they get more weight in the Senate, where every state, regardless of population, gets 2 senators.
Lonnie Guinier, you want to abolish the Electoral College. Make your case.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is the premise for the Electoral College was not based on protecting rural states per se. It was based on protecting the ability of Southern plantation owners to get a vote not only for themselves, but for their property. And so the Southern plantation owners got 1 vote for themselves, and then they got 3/5 of a person, so they got to vote for all of their slaves with this 2/5 discount. And I think that that is an illegitimate source that we have to confront when we talk about the Electoral College. That's number 1. Number 2, the issue of abolishing the Electoral College doesn't necessarily mean that the only alternative is direct election with a simple majority rule. Several people have talked about something called instant runoff voting, which would give people the opportunity to rank order their preferences for presidential candidates. And therefore, if some of the rural states or some of the less populated states wanted to prefer a particular candidate and organize around that person, they could do so without necessarily, quote, wasting their vote. So,
but what's the advantage of, what would be the advantage of that? What's wrong with the system now that essentially channels a lot of votes to one of the 2 major parties?
Well, the problem with the present system is that it encourages the major parties to essentially avoid developing local political organizations and just go over the heads of political organizations directly to the voter through television, and that essentially transforms an election into the selling of a product rather than mobilizing voters at the local level. So the assumption that it is the Electoral College that is protecting local interests, I think, is false.
Professor Best, how do you come down on this question?
Well, I support the electoral vote system, not the electors, but the electoral vote system, because it produces the right winner. And the right winner is the candidate who can govern this vast and diverse country, because he has formed a broad, cross-sectional federal coalition. He has won the popular vote in enough states. And I agree, the federal principle is the fulcrum of our entire constitutional system. The Constitution itself was ratified state by state. But more than that, the federal principle in presidential elections makes the president sensitive to state and local issues, and so supports the balance between national and local issues. But more than that, it also supports the separation of powers. If, for example, as the main thrust of the reform movement seems to be and has been, direct popular election, non-federal election, if the president were elected by a national plebiscite, then you tip the balance of power between the president and Congress dangerously toward the president, who then can claim to be the only authentic voice of the will of the people. I'd explain it to people this way. Baseball fans understand that the World Series, the right winner in the World Series, is the winner of 4 out of 7 games, not the one that scores the most runs overall. And likewise, the right winner in the presidential elections is the man who can govern because he builds a very broad coalition and gains the consent of the minority, because this system gives them the opportunity to be a part of the majority in many states and many, many minorities.
Could I just respond to one thing that
Yes,
Professor Best is saying? I think her baseball analogy is very apt for her point of view, but it is a flawed premise if we're talking about democracy. That is, this is not about identifying the winner of a game. This is about trying to encourage people to participate in the decisions that affect all of us. So I think the focus should be on how do we get more voters invested in the political process, how do we count their votes, how do we assure that more people participate, and not simply how do we choose between one of two, in my view, flawed candidates. So
Well,
I don't think the focus should be
May
just
I
on the
respond?
winners, but also on the participants, on the voters, on the citizens who are the governors in a democracy.
All right, Professor Lipson's trying to get in here, and we haven't heard from him for a while. Go ahead, sir.
It seems to me that the real problem here is that the bedrock principle of our country is one person, one vote. I grew up in a period in which rural districts were substantially overrepresented. Happily, we've done away with that kind of an approach. And I think that most of the original rules for the Electoral College, that if a group of wise people got together, that they could have the flexibility to choose their own person. None of that makes any sense anymore. I do think that the Constitution's hard to modify. That's a good thing. We shouldn't do it easily. But I think this is a case where the clear principle of one person, one vote should prevail, and any candidate who hopes to win will have to put together a wide coalition. He or she will have to go into the states and mobilize voters for turnout, if for nothing else. So I'm not taken by a lot of these other counter views.
Okay, well, let me get
Margaret, can I
it.
respond to
Yes,
that?
is this Professor Glenn, I hope?
Yes.
Yes, good.
It is.
Please
Margaret-
take on, if you will, say whatever you'd like to say, but take on this argument that we've
I want to
heard.
do the one man, one person,
Please.
one vote
and the
argument.
participation argument, too.
First of all, if American democracy is one person, one vote, then the House of Representatives is undemocratic because it's not elected on one person, one vote. nor is the Senate of the United States elected on one person, one vote. They both are elected on one person, one vote within an electoral district that exists within a state.
Right, what
and the
about
president is elected in exactly the same way. So we have one person, one vote for electing the president, contrary to what Professor Lipson says, but we count the votes by state, not as an aggregate national total.
All right, but let me ask you to address, just a minute, let me just ask Professor Glenn to address this other question, though, that I think viewers may be more interested in than the one person, one vote even, which has to do with participation and how much people feel that they're even being campaigned to or included in the process if they live in one of these states that is just considered a sure win for one candidate or the other. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, first of all, I don't know of any evidence supporting it, and I would ask Professor Lipson this question. Without the Electoral College, would there be any presidential campaigning from the Mississippi River to California? Those are large, sparsely populated areas, and there would be less reason than there now is with the Electoral College for candidates to campaign in those areas.
Well, I think
as a matter of fact, this year, the hotly contested areas were largely states that are in the Midwest and the near West. And so they got a great deal of attention.
But that's the current system.
Yeah, Ms. Guinier, I'll get right to you, just Professor Lipson, quickly on that point.
That's the current system. It seems to me that Denver and Houston and Dallas and a lot of cities, Salt Lake perhaps, would be seriously contested. So I just don't see that as a serious impediment to having a true nationwide campaign.
Okay, Professor Best.
I'd like to suggest that it's incorrect to say that a vote doesn't count in Texas because Texas was not a battleground state. Of course it counts unless there's fraud. And it has an impact. It has an impact on the popular vote, which is recorded. It has an effect on whether a president has a mandate or not, how high the mandate will be. It has an effect on the subsequent governing aspect. So I don't think it's fair to say that it doesn't count. And I think further that it's untrue that candidates would campaign all across the country. I think that they would then focus on the populous eastern megalopolis, Boston to Washington. They would focus on California. They would focus on major media markets. And then the people in small states would never see a candidate.
All right, Professor Guinier.